just like to say, I was asked to say a few words about the Brandenburg Lecture. David Brandenburg was chair of this department before I ever arrived. I never had the privilege of meeting him. But I remember coming to AU and being in the spring, very young assistant professor, and hearing about this Brandenburg Lecture. And over the years, I discovered that it was named in honor of this wonderful past department chair, but it's also a very special award because it recognizes our own. We always invite one of our own faculty members who has recently published a book, because we know how hard it is to publish books and how long it takes. And I've had the privilege of giving it twice. I'm looking around, I'm seeing my colleagues who have given the lecture over the years. And I'm really, really honored that this year we were able to partner because we have a very special lecture this evening from our Holocaust Studies postdoctoral fellow, Julie Keresztes. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about her in a minute, even though you've got her bio. I know that. I know you can all read. But this is for posterity. We're recording it, and they don't have the bio in front of them. But I want to tell you a little bit about this postdoctoral fellowship. I think my colleagues in the department know something about it, but I'm not sure how much. We have a very special relationship thanks to Professor Lisa Leff, who is the director of the Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and is also our longtime colleague in the Department of History. And 5 years ago, we set out to create this postdoctoral fellowship opportunity for the extraordinary scholars who are working on Holocaust studies. And the Holocaust Memorial Museum has a remarkable archive, the Chappelle Archive, and there are representatives of the Chappelle Archive here, and that this fellowship, it enables recent graduates of PhD programs to get some teaching experience. They teach one course each semester, one of which is always the history of the Holocaust in the history department. And then they also do their research at the archives at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And Julie Keresztes was our third postdoctoral fellow. Just want to tell you a little bit about where the first two have already launched. Our first one, Alana Holland, some of you may remember her. She actually came back to campus this year, gave a guest lecture in my class. She is now in her first year as a tenure track assistant professor of history at Washington and Lee University, and she continues to do her research on the history of the Holocaust in Eastern Europe, especially the Soviet Union. And she looks at both legal trials and cultural representations. And we're just thrilled that a couple of years after she was here, that she landed a tenure track job. Our second Holocaust Studies postdoctoral fellow, Catherine Heather, is now in her first year of a 3-year postdoctoral fellowship in Holocaust Studies at the University of California at Los Angeles at UCLA. And she's advancing her book project called Sounding Trauma, Mediating Memory, Holocaust Economy and the Politics of Sound. What really strikes me about that is that that's a whole area of Holocaust studies that people are interested in now. Is what did people know because they could hear? And I don't know how many of you might have seen the film Zone of Interest that won an Academy Award recently, but in Zone of Interest, you never go into the camp, but you do hear a lot of sounds in that soundtrack. So while we are sad, very sad, to bid farewell to Julie, whom I'll give her credentials, but I'm delighted, really delighted to report that we have already chosen our next 3-year postdoctoral fellow in Holocaust Studies, Dr. Alicia Podbielska, who has for the past 3 years been teaching Holocaust and anti-Semitism at Emory University, where she was replacing Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt, who was holding a position in the State Department, was a professor of Holocaust studies at Emory. And so she will be joining us, and her book project is already under consideration. She's a scholar of Poland, of memory of the Holocaust in Poland, which is a particularly contested issue, as Becca and Irv, the other people in my class, heard about today. And so I know that my colleagues will welcome her warmly. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Julie Keresztes. She holds the American University U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum Mandel Center Fellowship, and has had a slew of prestigious fellowships and grants, including from the German Historical Institute, the Leo Baeck Institute, which is represented here by Professor Michael Brenner, who's its president, and the American Academy for Jewish Research, which AU is also amply represented in. We have 3 elected members. And she's already working on her second book, a biography of Heinrich Hoffmann, Adolf Hitler's personal photographer. And that's because she was able to do some teaching, but also to spend so much time in the archives. But for us, it's a joy that using this fellowship so soon after earning her PhD, she completed the publication by Cornell University Press of Photography and the Making of the Nazi Racial Community. And so we're going to hear about that now. So please welcome Dr. Keresztes.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, Pam. This is a bittersweet moment for me because, of course, as Pam mentioned, my time at AU is coming to an end, and it has been such a privilege to teach so many fantastic students at AU for the last 3 years, and work with such amazing colleagues and friends, both here and at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and also have the opportunity to finish this book and begin working on my second. So it's truly an honor to be here this evening to give this year's Brandenburg Lecture, named for the late historian of France, Dr. David J. Brandenburg, who taught here at AU from 1948 to 1982. I'm grateful to the History Department and the Jewish Studies program for making this event possible, especially Pamela Nadel, Lisa Leff, Anton Fediashin, Mary Frances Giandrea, Eric Lohr, Emily Lefebvre-Dotzler, and I'm also grateful to Laura Cutler and Michael Brenner in the Meltzer Schwartzberg Center for Israel Studies for making it accessible to even more people. I thank all of you for coming too. It's wonderful to see so many colleagues as well as current and former students of mine here. And I hope I'll be able to meet many more of you after the talk. Again, thank you all for being here. My subject this evening is my first book, Photography and the Making of the Nazi Racial Community. I'd like to speak a bit about the book and introduce some of its key findings to you all. During the Q&A to follow, I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have about its content or my research process. I want to begin with an event that took place a little more recently than the Holocaust or World War II. The event was an exhibition that opened to the public in Hamburg, Germany, 30 years ago in March 1995. It was called War of Annihilation: Crimes of the Wehrmacht, 1941 to 1944. Produced by historians at the Hamburg Institute for Social Research, the exhibition presented evidence that confirmed the involvement of the regular German army, the Wehrmacht, in war crimes and genocide in the Soviet Union during World War II. In the decades leading up to this point, the blame for such atrocities had generally been placed on Adolf Hitler himself, other top Nazis, or the members of the paramilitary SS. The men of the Wehrmacht, many people believed, had not been involved. This deeply mistaken belief is what historians now call the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, and the purpose of the exhibition was to decisively put an end to it. This was no easy task. The German historian Hannes Heer, who organized the exhibition, estimated that every German family at the time included at least 1 to 2 men who had served in the Wehrmacht during the Second World War. Overturning the Wehrmacht myth, therefore, didn't just require upending what Germans thought they knew about an institution they still generally considered a respectable one. It also required upending what Germans thought they knew about their own family members. I simply cannot believe, the granddaughter of one Wehrmacht veteran told reporters at the exhibition, that my grandfather would have participated in such atrocities. Other visitors more readily embraced the exhibition's message. It's the truth, what's being shown here, a former soldier remarked. But denial, rather than acceptance, would continue to accompany many visitors well after they left the exhibition. Now, 30 years since the opening of the exhibition, historians see it as a major turning point in German memory culture regarding the Nazi past. But at the time, the exhibition was hotly contested and highly controversial. Bitter arguments unfolded between visitors as they worked through their memories and disagreed over deeply held beliefs. Mass protests took place in every city the exhibition appeared in Germany and Austria between 1995 and 1999. In the early morning hours of March 9th, 1999, a bomb exploded outside of the adult high school in Saarbrücken, where the exhibition had just been put on display. And it was not just the private and public narratives about the Wehrmacht that made the exhibition so controversial. The evidence it used did too. For in addition to official documents and letters, the exhibition also displayed around 1,400 photographs declared to have been made by Wehrmacht soldiers and discovered by Allied soldiers in their pockets and knapsacks when they were either killed or captured. The photographs were extremely difficult to look at. They showed soldiers taking part in mass shootings, hangings, and other acts of cruelty against Jews, prisoners of war, and civilians in Eastern Europe. Graphic visual evidence, in short, of the Wehrmacht's complicity in these crimes. This exhibition fascinated me as I began working on this project. It seemed to embody the long, complex, and difficult process involved in creating the candid memory culture for which Germany is now widely known and respected. And it raised questions about the photographs that appeared as evidence. One of these questions was about the number of photographs. Up to 4 million German soldiers were deployed on the Eastern Front during World War II and the Holocaust. They witnessed and committed horrific acts of violence and cruelty as they moved into the Soviet Union. Hannes Heer had estimated that every 2 of them carried a camera as they did so. Yet there were only 1,400 pictures available to document that violence and cruelty. Why weren't there more? The photographs on display raised additional questions about the broader role of popular photography, not only during the war, but before it as well. Was documenting persecution and atrocities what photography was primarily about under Nazism, as the exhibition suggested? Answering these questions required thinking about photography a little differently from the way in which I noticed other historians using them, primarily as illustrations, without much further comment. But photographs are important sources not only because of what and who they show or do not show. They are also important because of what they can reveal about photography as a pastime. Photography is a visual language, but it is a social one as well. Sociability has always been one of the key functions of photography since its invention. It still is today, as those of us who have cameras in our pockets right now know all too well. At numerous archives in Germany and the United States, I consulted written documents, newspapers, correspondence, and speeches to find out what Nazi officials had to say about photography. I also consulted testimonies, memoirs, and correspondence to learn how ordinary Germans spoke about photography and what it meant to them. And I saw hundreds of loose photographs and photograph albums made by soldiers and their families during the war. A few of the photographs I found did resemble the images on display at the 1995 Wehrmacht exhibition. But the overwhelming majority of the photographs I saw did not show these kinds of scenes. The violence and cruelty that I had expected to see, and which have predominantly been the focus for historians writing about German soldiers' photography since the 1990s, seemed suddenly invisible. Instead, I encountered photographs like those I'd like to show you now. They come from this album, which was donated to the US Holocaust Memorial Museum in 2022. American soldier John Rossick Jr. took it in 1945 from a home in the German town of Kripp, about a 30-minute drive south from Bonn, as Allied forces liberated the area. You can see that Rossick himself made a note of this in his own handwriting on the cover of the album. He was not alone in acquiring German photo albums in this way. That is part of the reason why there are so many in American archives today. The album Rossick took contains no visible captions or any other identifying information about its original owners, making its exact provenance a mystery. Based on certain clues within it, however, I suspect that the soldiers it depicts belong to the Wehrmacht's 31st Infantry Regiment, and that the album covers the period of roughly 1932 to 1942. The album also contains numerous photographs of men in SS Death's Head uniforms as well, suggesting both an institutional partnership between these specific units, as well as a variety of more personal friendships that the maker of this album clearly wanted to chronicle. If I am correct, the men in this album would have participated in the German invasion of Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. They also would have witnessed or directly participated in atrocities carried out in Poland and in the mass shootings carried out by German forces as they invaded Soviet territory, marking the start of what historians now refer to today as the Holocaust by bullets. None of that, though, is shown in the album. Instead, there are leisure scenes with soldiers and family. On this page, there are 4 photographs that show soldiers and their wives and children laughing, drinking, and eating at a cafe. Perhaps the soldiers were on leave, or perhaps these scenes were made before their departure from Germany. This man appears often throughout the album, so I take him to be the owner, and the woman seated next to him, possibly his wife. On the next page, more photographs show soldiers eating together and posing for the camera. On another page, photographs show soldiers eating again together on the side of the road, their equipment and weaponry in tow. Other pages feature portraits as well. There are portraits of the man I believe to be the original owner of the album, and portraits of other soldiers and officers that this man was close to or admired. And there are portraits of a different kind. Another page shows the gravesite of a German soldier named Hermann Bruch, who died in early 1942. The pages continue after this to show more group photographs as well as pictures of troop exercises and gear cleaning. The album portrays, on the one hand, an idyllic war, a war that has brought the soldiers pictured within it friendship, camaraderie, and plenty to eat and drink. It also, on the other hand, portrays a war in which Germans are the victims, another key narrative that would shape post-war memory. Only 2 photographs in the entire album hint at an alternative, more truthful view. The photograph on the bottom left shows civilians at a construction site, perhaps forced laborers under German supervision. And the photograph on the bottom right is an uncomfortably voyeuristic view of a group of civilian men walking through a cemetery. The hundreds of albums and loose photographs that I consulted for this book followed this same pattern. In each collection, I saw picture after picture of men relaxing together or with their families, eating and drinking, opening the mail, playing music, swimming, or embracing animals. I saw dozens of their self-portraits, portraits they had made of other soldiers, and many more photographs of family members and children. Only very rarely, if ever, did hints of the Wehrmacht's war of annihilation or the Holocaust appear in their photographs. Why did their collections look like this? Why didn't their photographs show the acts of violence they saw and committed? How could their photographs look so ordinary? Part of the answer, I learned, comes from the broader tradition of popular photography during times of war. During World War I, soldiers and their families used photography to commemorate their lives and tell stories about their wartime experiences. The photographs they included in their own albums featured similarly innocuous scenes with fellow soldiers and friends. And the Germans who remembered the albums they had seen or made themselves during the First World War continued this genre in the photography they pursued during the Second. But I learned as well that the other part of the answer requires understanding the specific role of popular photography in Nazi Germany. Popular photography had a unique role in German society under the Nazis. To Nazi officials, it was a tool that could help them make the idea of a racially exclusive community, or Volksgemeinschaft, a reality. Nazi leaders believed that popular photography, which they dubbed the people's art, could help Germans come together in support of the Nazi government. By taking photographs, sharing them with family, friends, and neighbors, and reflecting together on the experiences the images depicted, Germans could deliberately and voluntarily forge a community under Nazism. For Nazi officials, otherwise ordinary photographs became opportunities to reflect what defined Germany and Germans in a national and therefore a racial sense. With the help of camera retailers and Nazi organizations, the regime promoted photography for those who belonged to the Volksgemeinschaft. A November 1933 exhibition on photography, for example, encouraged beginners to take up photography because this work had new meaning and significance in the Nazi era. The leisure management organization Strength Through Joy, too, began offering photography classes in January 1936 so that everyone, from beginners to advanced hobbyists, could learn or refine the essentials of photography. The classes included cameras and film in enrollment costs that organizers kept as low as possible to make photography accessible to the public. These efforts resembled similar initiatives undertaken by the Nazis to make radios more accessible to Germans, so that Nazi broadcasts and speeches would be heard and internalized more frequently. Nazi officials envisioned popular photography as a unifying social practice then for racially desirable Germans. Excluding Jews from the practice was a key part of that vision. The absence of Jews, both in front of and behind the camera, was what Nazi officials hoped would define popular photography. And after 1933, Nazi officials, business people, and colleagues excluded Jews from organized professional photography, as well as amateur interest groups and associations. As part of their larger effort to impoverish Jews and terrorize them into leaving Germany during the 1930s, Nazi authorities stole photography studios and supply companies owned or operated by Jewish business people. One of them was Raphael Brenner. With his brother Leo and wife Nellie, Brenner had founded a photographic supply store in Cologne called Photo Brenner in 1919. There, they sold cameras, film, and other supplies until the Nazi takeover in 1933. The business was attacked as Jewish during the so-called boycott of Jewish-owned businesses on April 1st, 1933. Raphael Brenner was arrested, and the authorities made his release contingent on his agreeing to sell the business to an Aryan competitor, August Schmidt, for a fraction of its actual value. By July, the company had been fully Aryanized, and actually, you can see how the Nazis gleefully announced this in the press that month in the slide here, for Raphael Brenner kept the newspaper clipping. Of note as well is that the announcement is addressed to all amateur photographers and invites them to patronize Photo Brenner now that it has been declared an Aryan company. After the forced sale went through, Raphael Brenner fled Germany with his family, eventually arriving in the United States. He ended up here in Washington, D.C., where he reestablished Photo Brenner at 943 Pennsylvania Avenue, which would place it around where the FBI building is today. The heyday of German photography is over, he told an interviewer shortly after his arrival. Equipping non-Jewish Germans with cameras and film rolls was meant to do more, though, than just increase the number of hobby photographers. It was ultimately about preparing them for war. Nazi officials argued that the authorities had not gone far enough during World War I to mobilize wartime photography as a practice that could boost morale. Low morale, they argued, was part of the reason why Germany had lost that war. And as Nazi Germany began remilitarizing in the mid-1930s, they specifically began to encourage conscripted soldiers to take cameras with them to correct this mistake. Manufacturers designed the latest camera models to appeal to soldiers. Each new model, like this Agfa Billy Clack, was light, small, and durable, ideal for carrying in a soldier's pack. The authorities also handed out special albums with which to chronicle their service with the Wehrmacht. Doing so would strengthen comradeship between soldiers and bridge the distance between themselves and their loved ones back home. Doing so, in other words, would make the Volksgemeinschaft real. During the war, this messaging about the benefits of wartime photography was repeatedly reiterated in Wehrmacht publications. An advertisement for film in the June 1940 issue of Die Wehrmacht, for example, presents a cartoon drawing of 6 soldiers on leisure time. On the left, 2 of them are playing an accordion and a harmonica, 3 others are listening, and a 4th is photographing the scene. All 6 of them are smiling and smoking happily. On the right, we see the home front, where a postal worker delivers the soldier snapshots of this scene to his family. Women and children gather around to view the photos in the hands of the soldier's wife. And the entire exchange is bound together by the caption, "When the front takes pictures, the homeland rejoices." Women played crucial roles in these efforts as well. While officials instructed men to photograph their military adventures and social gatherings, They urged women to take pictures that would remind soldiers of home. Military officials also tasked women with arranging soldiers' albums. Given the cumbersome size of Wehrmacht-issued albums, soldiers would ideally receive them while on leave, rather than keeping them with them at the front. The soldier's mother or wife would then take charge of the album and arrange the pictures he sent her. Many of the albums housed in archives today, then, were carefully arranged, captioned, and preserved, not by the soldiers who took the pictures, but by the women assembling them back in Germany. By the time war began on September 1st, 1939, Nazi authorities had made photography accessible to more Germans than ever before. The American journalist William Shirer saw this for himself as he watched thousands of German soldiers from his hotel in Berlin shortly after the beginning of the war. I watched them staring at the Brandenburg Gate, the Reichstag, and snapping photographs, he noted. The Germans, I'm convinced, are the most camera-mad people in the world. I have yet to meet one on the street without a camera slung on his or her shoulder. And apart from making cameras more available to them, Nazi authorities had also taught Germans two important lessons about photography. First, that it was a practice meant only for Aryan Germans, and second, that practicing photography together would connect Germans in a single racial community. Both lessons would acquire new significance as Germany's armed forces went to war and carried out the Holocaust. Soldiers and their families used photography during the war to do precisely that, to picture and strengthen their relationships between themselves and fellow members of the Nazi Volksgemeinschaft. Soldiers sent home pictures that would remind their families of them, reassure them that they were healthy and not alone, and let them know that they were thinking of them. They presented themselves as loyal husbands, devoted fathers, and good comrades. The historian David Harrisville has recently shown how German soldiers crafted these narratives through their letters and diaries, and that doing so helped make the clean Wehrmacht myth a wartime and not just a post-war phenomenon. I would add that soldiers used their photography to do this as well. And their families reciprocated by arranging the pictures they sent in albums and sending pictures of their own, precisely as the authorities would have it, to remind them of home and lift their spirits. By the winter of 1941, after all, it was clear that the war would take much longer than the 4 months Hitler had estimated the German invasion of the Soviet Union to last. Well after this point, soldiers' photographs focused on their ties to fellow members of the Volksgemeinschaft. Soldiers' photographs may have concealed the realities of war and the Holocaust, but they were more candid about what they had seen and done in their correspondence. One Wehrmacht soldier told his parents and sister on Christmas Day in 1941 that he had made pictures of the Ukrainian landscape that he planned to send them. He went on to tell them, "The Jews have now fortunately gone. The Ukrainian population was very happy about it because the night shootings have subsided. Of course, many Jewish people have already died, and it is good that they are now locked up together and die on their own." Like many others, this particular soldier did not bother to take pictures of the atrocities he witnessed, helped perpetrate, and spoke openly about to his family. He was simply glad that the Jews were gone. Anti-Semitism, then, did not manifest itself solely in propagandistic images of Jews or scenes of atrocity and torment. It also manifested itself in the very absence of Jews in the pictures soldiers were taking. To my surprise, I found that even SS men used photography in similar ways, despite the distinct training and wartime roles of their makers. Like Wehrmacht soldiers, SS men also turned to photography for opportunities to create wartime narratives about themselves. They compiled photo albums commemorating their wartime employment in Waffen-SS combat units, as well as the SS Death's Head regiments that staffed the Nazi concentration and killing centers. SS men, like Wehrmacht soldiers, rarely included photographs of the violence, mass murder, and abuse they oversaw and committed in these albums. They far more often used photography to portray themselves as good and important. The albums created by Johann Niemann while he was deputy commandant of the Sobibor killing center are one example. There are no photographs of the 167,000 Jews murdered while Niemann was at Sobibor between 1942 and 1943. Instead, we see a happy man surrounded by adoring colleagues and family members. Most of these men also abided by the regulations for photography devised by state and military authorities. Wehrmacht soldiers and SS men made their collections under strict guidelines and regulations concerning photography, regulations that are not always typically taken seriously by historians. Wehrmacht and SS officials repeatedly threatened their men, particularly between 1941 and 1944, that only the production and distribution of what they called good pictures was allowed. Anything else, including photographs of atrocities, was forbidden. These orders were not, of course, uniformly effective or followed, for some disobeyed them and took pictures anyway. These cases of disobedience made the orders necessary in the first place. But despite these exceptions, the orders were generally enforced and followed. During a 1941 shooting of Jews in Ukraine, for example, a German soldier who witnessed the incident later recalled that it had been photographed by SS men, but that an officer destroyed their film after discovering that they had done so without permission. The omissions in Wehrmacht and SS photo collections must be seen within this context as well. Chronicling the stark reality of the war and the Holocaust was instead a project undertaken by the victims of Nazi persecution. It was precisely those the Nazis excluded from the Volksgemeinschaft who would ultimately use it to reveal the experiences of the Nazi regime's victims. In German-occupied towns, ghettos, and camps throughout Eastern Europe, Jews and non-Jews used photography to document and preserve evidence of the Holocaust. In the book, I focus on how this worked in Nazi concentration camps. There, SS photographers captured executions, beatings, and other scenes for camp administrative records. Prisoners who had access to those records through their forced labor in the Camp Photographic Identification Service used this proximity to preserve evidence of what was taking place there. Concentration camp prisoners also took extraordinary risks to create their own photographs documenting the Nazi camps. At Buchenwald, for example, the French political prisoner Georges Angeli, with the help of 3 fellow prisoners who shielded him from view, photographed the camp. Angeli managed to take 12 photographs of Buchenwald, which also depict prisoners in front of Block 46, where medical experiments were conducted. At great risk to their lives then, concentration camp prisoners took it upon themselves to gather evidence of the horrors of the Nazi project, horrors that Germans largely did not show in their private photographs and albums. I'd like to close by returning to the questions I raised at the beginning of this talk. First, why were there only 1,400 photographs at the 1995 exhibition documenting the atrocities and cruelty Wehrmacht soldiers were involved in during the German invasion of the Soviet Union? Rather than show the reality of their involvement in war crimes and genocide, these soldiers were far more interested in photographing themselves and presenting themselves to their families as good comrades, fathers, and husbands. These narratives were encouraged by state and military officials who saw popular photography as an effective way to boost morale and construct a Nazi Volksgemeinschaft. And this initiative had long predated the war. Second, why do so many soldiers' photographs look so ordinary? Well, for one thing, that was precisely the point of popular photography during the Nazi period, to reflect on and celebrate the Volksgemeinschaft while concealing what this vision cost those who were excluded from it. Moreover, their photographs look ordinary because so were they, and so were their families, their primary audience. That is what makes these images so chilling. They serve as reminders that Holocaust perpetrators were capable of human emotions like love, homesickness, and affection, while also holding racist and anti Semitic beliefs and watching and committing horrific crimes against Jews and other victims of the Nazis. They were what the historian Christopher Browning famously called ordinary men who generally made and shared very ordinary photographs. But the relative absence in these albums of atrocity photos never meant that their creators were innocent, nor did it signify anything less than a total devotion to the war and the mass murder it entailed. Instead, that absence simply reveals what so much popular photography was really about under the Nazis. Thank you all for listening. I look forward to your questions. So, any questions? Michael.
Thank you. Excellent way of presenting the question of the book in 30 minutes. I wonder if I can also pose the question the other way around.
Hmm.
Why were there so many, like 1,400 photographs? Because as you convincingly said, first of all, it was like forbidden in
Mhm.
right? And then why would you take pictures of atrocities and send them home to your family, right? So my question is a bit the other way around. What was the motive of those who did take the photographs of the atrocity? And do you know of any punishments against them? Obviously, the Nazi leadership did not.
Mhm. Thank you, Michael. Those are great questions. Yes, luckily there's a really vast literature on that subject, why so many people did take photographs like this during the war. And I think it actually has something to do with my idea about photography so closely shadowing this idea, this vision of the Volksgemeinschaft. A lot of soldiers did this precisely to envision the outsiders, the people who were excluded from that community, and also to celebrate their destruction. So a lot of the motives there for taking these kinds of pictures was celebratory. And certainly that celebration had a social function as well. Actually, most of those types of photos, the atrocity photos, were typically shared among soldiers and not so much shared between soldiers and family members. And so there was this celebratory function to those particular images that I think are also at play and explain why there were those 1,400. I do know of a few accounts that did involve punishment in a more kind of rank and file sense. Typically, what would happen if a soldier was caught making those kinds of photos is that their camera would be confiscated, or as I mentioned in that example, the film would be destroyed as well. A particularly extraordinary case of punishment that I talk more about in the book is the case of an SS man who took and sent back to his family scenes of a mass shooting and was actually brought to trial by the SS for doing so, and actually served some time in Dachau for doing that as well. I think that was an exceptional case. I think that was supposed to be sort of a show trial to scare other soldiers into not doing this, and eventually Heinrich Himmler had him personally released. But there was some punishment involved. But overall, I think the very important phenomenon of these atrocity photos does kind of harken back to the boundaries of this Volksgemeinschaft idea, and that on one hand, German soldiers wanted to celebrate and depict its members, and where you get the atrocity photos is the sort of disdain and celebrating of the destruction of those who didn't belong. Yes, Christian.
I suppose one thing that you, thank you for the talk, one thing that you very much emphasized was the relationship between the soldier and their family as they were sending back. I was curious, was there any effort on any end for these photographs that soldiers were taking to be shown to a wider public audience? Or was it very personalized solely through the albums? Was there an effort to show like wartime photos to try to raise public morale or something of that nature?
Yeah, thank you, Christian. That's a great question. Every now and then, there actually were exhibitions that could be viewed in various German towns or cities, depending on who was there to organize it. So that did sometimes happen, and those pictures tended to be just like these, focusing on victories, focusing on comradeship, sophistication of weaponry, and things like that. A sort of similar view of the war that exhibition organizers would have found comforting to people, especially as the war went south for Germany, particularly after 1943. So that was one way that those photographs circulated to a wider audience. I've also seen evidence that shows that specific units had their own individual troop chronicled through a unit album and not just individual personal albums. And so that would have been another way that these individual private photographs would have been seen and shared by a greater audience. Yes.
You mentioned that some of the photos came after they were taken from the bodies or captured prisoners, and some were obviously in the albums we discussed. Is there a large difference in the kind of photos that come from the two different sources, or are they largely much the same? The photos the soldiers were carrying, like what they were sending home?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking it. Yes, so as I may have hinted to before, the photographs that soldiers shared among each other tended to be much more violent. Those photographs tended to show some of the scenes that would have appeared in that 1995 exhibition. And the reason for that is, I think, the ideological function, the celebratory function, the explanations and justifications soldiers were making at this time to keep fighting the war and keep killing as many people as they were. And so the photographs, the loose photographs that soldiers kept on themselves and copied and sent to each other did typically have much more of a violent tone than the ones they sent to their families.
The ladies first situation. Thank you for this talk. I was curious about actually the process of, like, at what point along the line these photos were developed, and
Hmm.
from film to pictures,
Mm-hmm.
thinking about the mechanism of censorship.
Mm-hmm.
So, could a soldier send film home to his family, or did they have to be printed out, and was someone sort of opening the envelope, looking at them before they went?
Mm-hmm.
And similarly, I mean, for these soldiers, especially relationship, like, do they have mechanisms in a fairly mobile army in, a world of blitzkrieg, sort of developing film and then sort of passing, atrocity shots around their unit? How was the actual development there? I mean, these other great initiatives trying to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much, Laura. Those are great questions. Yeah, so it's interesting. Soldiers developed their photos pretty much in all of the ways you just said that they did. So one source for it would actually be the Wehrmacht propaganda units that closely shadowed troops as they moved across Europe. So they would use their resources often to develop those photographs that way. They would also often basically force their way into local photography studios. I've seen evidence, especially from photography studios in Poland, that were basically forced to develop a wide range of German soldiers' photography and actually contributed a great deal to the resistance for that role because they were developing often less than good pictures, according to the German authorities. And a lot of soldiers did send their film rolls home to their wives, and I've seen a lot of letters that ask or sometimes even just tell their wives, develop this for me, put it in the album. I've written out the order that they should go to and the captions, take this to our local shop and have these developed. So really it was a wide range of different options that they had. And I think the number of those options does itself testify to this wartime promotion of photography, that there were so many resources available to them for doing this. And as far as censorship is concerned, yes, there was certainly censorship, especially if soldiers included photographs themselves that had been developed already in letters home. And I did see in the archives an example of two censored photos that showed a hanging scene from Ukraine in 1942. Those were censored, but I think depending on the form that the photographs took, it would have been much harder to censor others, even though they did make certainly an attempt to do so. Eric.
Yeah, to comment on this, I was wondering how soldiers in, say, British, American, French, other, Italian armies, whether they also sent kind of sanitized versions of the war home to the photographs that they sent out.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking probably they didn't want to disturb too much of the realities of war and that kind of thing. And in that sense, what was the sanitized case? And then the second thing is, I vaguely remember in the early 1990s, there was a documentary that was released in German television of video snippets that
Mm-hmm.
soldiers had taken and put together in a really disturbing film that showed, German soldiers playing in the Black Sea and talking about how this was going to be part of the Great German Reich. And it was all very happy and smiley, and it was,
Mm-hmm.
the wonderful feats of the German army, very hints that anything bad was going on. And it had a big impact in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
Was video film part of your study as well?
Thank you, Eric. Those are great points and great questions. So I'll start with the first question: what's unique about the German case? I think what makes the German case unique is perhaps not so much the images themselves, but the ideas and the context that inform the meaning of these images. And so I think that is above all what makes them stand out and makes them different from other types of photography, and certainly the other Allied soldiers who are also making and sending pictures home. I do think that in a lot of these images, you can see traces of other things that make this particular case unique. You can see portraits of Hitler in the background in a lot of these rooms, swastikas everywhere. And of course, knowing the context of war and genocide is also something that makes it stand out. There's a very interesting collection at Harvard University at the Houghton Library. And this collection is, I think, around 200 wartime photo albums made not just by German soldiers, but American soldiers, Italian soldiers, French soldiers. And for the most part, they do typically, I think, include photographs in there that want to have this sort of morale boosting function. But I have to say that actually some of the most violence I've seen in photo albums come from the American soldiers. There are some pretty horrific scenes in those albums that I saw. So I think it's still an ongoing question for me, the sort of international dimensions of this and this practice. This is just one part as you suggested, of a much broader and more global phenomenon during war. So it's certainly something to consider. Oh, and then film. Yes. So your second question about film. So, of course, I think about film a lot, and those of you who have taken my classes know that I use a lot of it in class. But I think that for this book and in general, I focus more on still photography for a couple of reasons. One is that to me, it's actually a completely different genre than film. It's a completely different medium. It requires a different set of tools and knowledge. And the other thing that makes it different for me is that many more people had access to still photography than they did video cameras. And that to me makes photography much more of a sort of mass phenomenon, a true popular pastime in every sense of the word. But certainly film has to be taken into account as well, especially when those narratives line up. And especially if and when, which is sometimes something that I've seen as well in the archives, the people taking the photographs also made videos every now and then. So it's something that I consider, but on the whole, for those reasons, it's the still photography that I focus on. Lisa. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Lisa. That's precisely what I think the post-war use for these albums was. That part of the reason why that myth of the clean Wehrmacht was so durable is because when grandfathers and fathers pulled out their photographs and their albums to show their children and their grandchildren what they had done during the war, what the war was like, those pictures that you see here and in the other albums did present a very distorted view, a very clean view of what they and their unit and the broader Wehrmacht had done. And so I think that these albums very much contributed to the distortion and the selective memory during that post-war period. A lot of the albums, as you mentioned, are still waiting to be discovered in closets and in attics and cupboards. A lot of them are also often sold at flea markets and on eBay and online. So it's sort of a situation where there's many, many more out there that are waiting to be discovered and might show new things about this history that we don't necessarily know yet. But yes, I think the function of these images was really important in the post-war period for contributing to that distortion and selective memory. Max. Okay. Great. Thank you, Pam. Yes. Yeah.
That's all right. So it's a similar question. So many German men were kept in Soviet prisoners as years, and we know about how that distorted family relationships, made possible new ones. The families that recognize sometimes assumed that certain things were getting bad. In reality, they don't even mention that. And that reminds
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. That's a great question. I actually have seen a lot of evidence to suggest, especially in correspondence and the Berlin Feldpostarchiv, where I've spent a good amount of time, in their letters that continue very much after 1945. Some of them from those precise locations and prisons do refer to the photographs as a sort of remember me. I'm gonna come back for you. In the meantime, look at these albums, show the kids my picture so they don't forget about me. And some of them, of course, never came back. Some of them did, but I have seen, yes, some discussion about the role those photographs played in the meantime. And I think, as far as future research with this topic, I think that would be a fascinating subject to explore, the sort of longer term use of these wartime photographs to facilitate these reunions and these really broken and disrupted relationships. So I've definitely seen some evidence for that, but it would definitely be interesting to explore that further. Thank you.